Okay. Yeah. All right. So for the last time, Matthew chapter 5.
Well,
We're going to finish up Matthew chapter 5 today. But Bill reminded me that CT asked a question 2 weeks ago, and I meant to answer that question last week, and I forgot.
I hadn't forgotten yet. I was
All right, but you should have brought it back up then, CT. So I actually did some study on that question, and I got to tell you, it's so amazing the ridiculous things that people post about hard questions like that, and so I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't find anyone who had an answer that I really liked, and so I'm going to give you my answer, and whether you like it or not. If you don't like it, I assure you, you can find another answer to the question somewhere online. So the question that CT raised, we were talking about lying, and he raised a question about Rahab and whether she was right in lying to the spies when they came, and she was hiding out. She was hiding out the whoever it was who she was hiding out. And then, there was another question connected to that about, well, gee, what about people in the military? Are they supposed to lie, not supposed to lie, or give away the position of somebody, et cetera, et cetera. So, and again, I found, some people would rationalize it for this particular situation. Other people would say, well, it's okay if you just don't tell a lie, you just don't tell the truth. Well, as we talked about last time, I think that's the same as lying. So I don't think that's a way out of that question. And again, you may not like my way out, but here's the answer that I came up with. We've got to remember that the section that we're looking at, this whole of chapter 5, is about the heart, right? He's worried about our heart, and he's worried about our heart more than our actions. It's really what's going on in your heart. What are you thinking? Why are you doing the things that you're doing? And so I think in this particular case, he is saying to Rahab, what's in Rahab's heart, right? What is she thinking when she does that? If it's really about, because if the lying is to benefit us, then it's clearly sinful. But if the lying is to benefit others, then there's a line there, I think. Then there's a question that got to be raised, because if in your heart you're doing something of value to someone else by not telling the truth, this is where I think the line gets drawn. Now, the problem with that is it's a fuzzy line, right? And it allows you to rationalize, lying, and because we're human. And because we're human, we think sinfully, and so we will put that line in places that doesn't belong. But I think clearly there's a line, because we see in many different places in the Old Testament where someone does not tell the truth, and in every case, it's about someone else. It's not about them. It's not to try to protect themselves. It's not to try to make themselves look good. It's in every case they're trying to help someone else. So that's where I draw the line. That's my answer. I'm sticking to it. And again, if you don't like it, feel free to read the commentaries and you'll find another one. Any comments on that before we go forward? CT, any thoughts?
And I've never been able to rationalize any better answer than that either.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I think particularly because he was in this section about the heart, it just seems to fit. I think that's the message he's trying to get across.
there are times that I've heard stories where somebody, so another story so there's other non-biblical stories where Christians have had to, lie to protect people. Corrie ten Boom was one. I think there was some stuff with her, and then there's a couple other missionaries that they end up having to lie to protect people, to save people, hide people.
To do the Lord's work.
They're doing the Lord's work. I still sometimes in the very back of my head, I go, God does miracles.
Yeah.
To not lie, what would God have done?
Right.
And so I don't know.
Yeah. I get you. I get the same confusion in my head about it. I understand.
Great to have a little bit of discussion about it. I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you bringing it up. It made me dig into it a little bit, and that's always a good thing. All right, Matthew chapter 5.
Easy trap to fall into, though, is you made the comment about doing it for somebody else. And it's awfully easy to rationalize that, yeah, I'm doing it for somebody else, but I'm, in the long term, I'm really doing it for myself.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the danger, Rick. Yeah, that's the danger. What can I say?
Also, just another circumstance, the mission work we do in countries that are violently opposed to Christ, there's a lot of deception that has to go on in that work.
Yeah.
Just to be able to be there and to
Right.
share the gospel. So it's
a similar question. Yep.
Self. It's not for self, it's for others. But
I would just put it on your list, to ask God when you get there.
We're gonna forget we had a list.
Who's gonna count that?
Something tells me that list is not going to be very important when we get there, but feel free to put it on the list. All right. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 to 48. So obviously we're ending Matthew 5. And what we really have here is, the last example again of him talking about chapter 5, verse 20, right, where your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. He's still answering that question. What does it mean? And really what we have here in 43 through 48 is a summary, is the big answer to that question that really encapsulates all of the other answers that he's already given. So it's a pretty important section that we have here in front of us. And I have lost my notes somewhere. Hold on. There they are. Okay. So let's go ahead and read it, and then we will come back and dig it apart. So verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your enemy, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than the others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Okay, so back to verse 43. So as we've kind of had a pattern here is to try to understand what the Old Testament said, try to understand what the Pharisees did in messing up the teaching, and then spend most of the time looking at what Jesus actually teaches on the subject. So verse 43, it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So the first part of that, you shall love your neighbor. That comes from a passage in Leviticus 19:18. We're not going to turn there, but that's where it is. But you'll remember the passage. It says, love your neighbor, but then it has something else. You remember what it says? Love your neighbor, what? Somebody said it.
As yourself.
As yourself, right? And Jesus quotes this in the New Testament, right? When he summarizes the law, he says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, this is exactly what it says in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. But the Pharisees, that was a bridge too far for them to love their neighbor as themselves. That would mean they would have to love them a lot more than they do. So that was one of the ways that they misused the Old Testament, and we'll come back and talk about that. But then the other thing it says here, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, there's no scripture in the Old Testament where it says love your neighbor and hate your enemy, right? And the other thing is that when they talk about the neighbor, the Jews, when they talked about that, they just meant other Jews, right? So love other Jews, hate everyone else, right? Certainly that Samaritan, right, that might be walking along the road and injured, we're certainly going to hate them. And in fact, it's your right as a Jew, because you are so much better than everyone else. It's your right to look down on them, to hate them. it's your duty to stand up for Jews and let them know. And you remember that this is, when Jesus talked about tearing down the middle wall of partition, right? It was that very thinking that he was trying to tear down, the way that they thought about non-Jews as not their neighbor and someone to be hated. So before CT asks the question, so God tells us here to love our enemies. Does God ever tell us not to love our enemies? Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20. In case anybody thinks I'm picking on CT, I really appreciate those questions. Because they make me think, and I need that. So Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16. Says, but of the cities of these people which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive. You shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, just as the Lord your God has commanded you, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done to your gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. So here he's telling them, for all these people, I want you to wipe them out. Nothing that breathes shall remain alive. And then I want you to remember 1 Samuel. Go there a minute. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, you'll remember this story. 1 Samuel 15. We'll start at verse 3. The Lord tells Saul here to go and attack the Amalekites. In verse 3, it says, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant, nursing child, ox, sheep, camel, and donkeys. And Saul gathered the people together, and they went out and attacked the Amalekites. The problem was, down in verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag, who was the king, and the best of the sheep, and the oxen, and the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroy. So here they reinterpreted what God said. Certainly God didn't mean for us to destroy everything. We should keep all the good stuff for ourselves and just destroy all the worthless stuff. And then I love verse 14. Samuel, the prophet, realizes what's going on. In verse 14, it says, but Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen which I hear, right? He's going, wait a minute, why are there still sheep and oxen? You were supposed to destroy everything, and he brings them back to the command of God. All right, so here we have cases where God has told them to destroy all these people, right? And then one more in the New Testament, I want you to see something that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 23, one of our verses we keep going, chapters we keep going to. When we get there, we should have it all covered. Matthew chapter 23, we'll just look at verse 13. Matthew 23:13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go to yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses and pretend to make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. So here we have Jesus, when he says, woe to you, and we'll get this when we get to chapter 23, but that word woe means damned, okay? He's saying, damned are you. He's saying, you damn hypocrites, you damn Pharisees, you are damned, okay? So let's go back to now to Matthew chapter 5, verse 43. You've heard that it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say something else. So what is going on where God in the Old Testament is judging these whole nations? Jesus is condemning, is damning these Pharisees, and yet here he's pushing back against hating your enemy. What's going on there? Any thoughts?
Does that have anything to do with the concept of loving the sinner but hating the sin?
I think it does.
It also has something to do with the presence of Christ.
What do you mean by that, CT?
Christ in the New Testament, it seems like we direct differently to non-believers. Christ has come and said, "Hey, love these people. Do this. Be like me. Be like you're supposed to treat yourself." In the Old Testament, and as you read through, it's destroy everybody that's not that is an unbeliever. Hundreds of thousands of people die, and so to me, it seems like there's something different after Christ came, that you're loving them to try to draw them to Him.
But you do remember Revelation, don't you, CT? That is in the New Testament.
I'm gonna die.
Yeah.
So is it because we're no longer under the law, where it's a new covenant? Yeah, exactly.
What do you mean by that, Michelle? What's the difference?
I think Christ died.
He was
for
the
all.
sacrifice for all.
Now, Revelation, not all will be there, right? Or actually, the New Testament tells us not all will be there, but Christ died for everyone. So love everyone, because it's not our decision of who goes to heaven or hell.
Yeah, we're going to talk about love in a minute. I'm talking about hate right now.
Revelation is at the end, after everybody's been there, done that. To me,
Mhm.
during this time now, we're trying to reach everybody.
Well, some of that, God directly told them to do it.
Yeah.
So when God told them to do it, He had to have a good reason. You might not understand it, but I mean, they were directed from God.
I think you can separate, I mean, maybe, but in one case, they were instruments of God's justice. And then, you're talking about how we should personally, feel for or act towards people. So I think there's probably two different things. Like you said, with the rest of the Beatitudes, it's personally our heart. And in this case, I think we're dealing with like God's justice against the Macolites, or God's justice against, sin, and His holiness. So I think we're kind of mixing both of them in some way.
Yeah, so that's dead on right, Hugh. I think we got to realize that God is a God of judgment and God is a God of love, right? Both those things have got to be true in our thinking. And if you get those out of balance, this is where, weird groups of religious people pop up, when you get His judgment, His wrath, and His love out of balance. So, God judges people, right? And He's allowed to. He's supposed to. It's what He does. He judges people. He judges them at the end of Revelations. He judges them in the Old Testament. Jesus judges them in the New Testament. Now, we haven't gotten to these verses yet, but we're told not to judge. And by the word judge, I mean condemn, right? God condemns. Jesus condemns. We do not have the authority to condemn. So when we see Jesus condemning, or we see God condemning in the Old Testament, that's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. It's not what we're supposed to do. So if you believe that God is a God of judgment, then He will judge, and He does judge. And that's different, though, from what we're talking about here. We're talking about, as you said, a personal offense. And what is our response to a personal offense? Because there's no issue with God or Jesus pronouncing judgment for sin, but that's not our job. God has said, I am a God of judgment and I am a God of love. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And here He says, love is yours. That's a very important principle right up front. Any pushback on that before we go? Because that's important.
Just to add to use statement that certainly is God's judgment, but God was also ordering that destruction, especially in the Old Testament, because he was protecting the Israelites as his chosen people. He didn't want them intermingling with other cultures and their gods corrupting the Israelites.
Right, exactly. And we don't, it's interesting. We don't see God's judgment today like that, but God is judging today. There is judgment going on today. We just don't see it like the whole group of the Amalekites, whatever they are, getting wiped out.
And then all the things that happen today, our religious or organizations are getting contaminated left and right with allowing the world to filter in and get in.
See what's right.
All right, so let's look at Jesus's teaching. So that's the distortion. That's what the Old Testament said. That's the distortion that the Pharisees had on top of it. Let's look at what Jesus says. Again, verse 44, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. So, what's amazing here, Jesus is saying, love your enemies, right? And this is not any different from what he's been teaching already in Matthew chapter 5, right? Where we talked about last time, when you're slapped in the face, turn the other cheek, right? When you're humiliated, turn the other cheek. Don't withhold your shirt, give them your coat also, right? If you go 1 mile, if he forces you to go 1 mile, give them 2. All of those things can be summarized as, I want you to love them, right? When these people do these things to you, your response ought to be to love them. Not any different from what he says here. Bless them who curse you. Do good to them who hate you. Pray for them who spitefully use and persecute you. He's saying, I want you to love those who harm you, who abuse you, who humiliate you. All right, I'm going to talk about this in general first, and then we're going to get to specifics. The first general statement is, our treatment of others cannot depend upon what they are or what they do. Let me say that again. Our treatment of others cannot be dependent upon what they are or what they do. Does that make sense? Do you get that? It must be controlled by our view of them and their condition. Our treatment of them has got to be controlled by our view of them and their condition, right? Their condition is they are sinners. And our treatment of them has got to be as sinners, not as someone who has abused me, someone who has attacked me. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, why does God treat his enemies so well?
To win them to himself.
Partially, yeah. Why else?
Isn't it everything we do should be for God's glory to win others to Christ?
Yeah, for us, I agree. Why does God do it? Why does God treat enemies well?
His love.
He knows their heart.
Yeah, CT got it that time.
Now I'm done for the year.
Because that's his character, right? Again, God is love. God is love, and that's why he treats enemies well. It's who he is. Now, I'm gonna come back to that because some of you have that look on your face. But before I do, let me ask this question: why should we treat others well? And before you answer, let me give you some negatives. It's not so that they will be nice to us, right? I'm going to treat you well, and so therefore you'll treat me well. I'll be nice to you, do unto others, they'll do unto you, right? Be nice to you, you'll be nice to me, and that's why I'm going to do it. Or it'll certainly bring out the good in you if I'm good to you. Right? It'll bring out that good in you. We've heard that kind of a statement. Right? So why is it that we should treat them in this way? Why do this?
So Christ can, I mean, so they can see Christ in you, what he's taught you.
And
And
because God told us to.
And that's what Christ would do?
Yeah, I mean, it really goes back to what Michelle was saying earlier, right? I mean, it's really about us showing them the character of God, which attracts them to God, right? So you are showing your enemies love, and therefore they can see a characteristic of God, and therefore they can be attracted to God because God is love. In verse 45, does this get dark in there?
No.
No.
I don't know. Is there a cloud hanging over us?
That was very weird.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You know, Delaney's a teacher and she gets concerned because she's got middle schoolers that are trying to find themselves and the crazy world now with the people that are want to be called they versus he, she, or whatever. And then the whole, you know, homosexual thing. And Delaney has had several of them come to her because she tries to show them love. But she's like, how do I show love, but not, because I think they see her probably as being accepting. Yeah, agreeing with, yes. And how do you draw that? Do you know what? I don't know how to ask.
I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, and we usually take one side or the other of that question and say, well, I have to reject you, and therefore I won't talk to you, and therefore I'll be mean to you, which obviously Delaney's not doing. You know, always we'll take the other side, and I'm accepting. Never actually have the conversation, right? I never let you know exactly how I feel about it. And I think, you know, there were many times where I was in a training session where something like this would come up. and I would use the phrase, as far as I understand and what I believe is this, right? Not that you have to believe it, not that I'm forcing it on you, but I would let them know that this is what I believe. I believe this. And I think you got to make that statement, you got to make that stance, or they just, as you said, they just believe everything, you know, you're accepting of everything that's there. Now that's tricky, right? And you could get in trouble for it, but either you're going to be honest about your stance or you're not. And you know, what 9 out of 10 times happened to me is when I would take that kind of stance, half of the class would come up after me afterwards and say, "Gee, I really appreciate you staying there," right? So, I'm not saying that's easy to do, but
Do you have any thoughts about how significant you make that, or how often? I mean, do you just say time, tell that person one time, here's what I think, and this is, you know, blah, 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 or do you have to say it more often or again and again? We're trying to figure that out. I mean, we have that are going through issues, and I don't, it's crazy.
it does go back to love the sinner, hate the sin, right? But you just got to be clear about that. You know, CT, I don't know the answer to your question, obviously, but they will understand your stance if you let them know what your stance is. And you just, that doesn't mean you ever give up on them, you ever don't love them, you don't ever throw your arm around them, but you got to let them know where you stand. Okay, let's keep going. Verse 45, I don't want you to miss this part. Let's read 44 and 45 again. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who spitefully use you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. So one of the reasons to do this is to show them the character of God, to attract them to God. And it also shows that you're just like God, right? It shows that you are a son of God. It shows you that he's your dad and that you're just like your dad, right? And that's why you should act this way. It shows them that you're just like your dad, that that divinity of God is in you. And that's why you're treating him this way. That's why you're loving them. That's why you're encouraging them. That's why you're bringing the truth to them. All of that is part of being like God. So, how do we do this? This is hard. How do we do this? One thing, and honestly, if I don't go back to the Beatitudes in every lesson, I've missed it, right? But you've got to detach yourself from other people. But what I mean is detach yourself from responding, reacting to what other people say and do. Right? So this is all about when someone curses you, when someone slaps you on the right cheek, right? Someone persecutes you, how do you respond? You got to detach yourself from that person. And in fact, and you also have to detach yourself from yourself. It's not about how you feel about it. It's not about, as long as you are living for yourself, you are sensitive, you are jealous, you are envious, you get hurt, you are angry, as long as you're living for yourself. But if you're living for Christ, right, then these hurts, these pains are not the same. It's also recognizing that you're in a different kingdom. You're in a different world. You're not a mere man. You are an eternal creature. And that therefore you should be just like God, right? We're supposed to be growing to be like Christ, like God, and God is love. You can be like God. Why? Because the divine Holy Spirit is within you. And we certainly see this with Jesus on the cross, right? When he looks down and says, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." So the question to ask yourself is, are other people's actions controlling me? Are what they're saying, what they're doing, is it controlling the response in me? Are your thoughts and actions governed by the words of others, by the actions of others? Are your thoughts governed by the actions and words of others? It's interesting. God looks down. He sees evil actions by men in the world, and he recognizes them as acts of Satan, right? He sees, oh, I see evil, that's Satan operating. We see personal offenses, right? We see something against me rather than, oh, I see that is Satan working in that person's life to make them do that, to have them respond in that way. That mindset change is super critical, important to us actually understanding what's going on here. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And then, when we have that perspective, then we've got to have the positive concern for them, right? And their eternal fate. We realize they're a dupe of Satan, and that's why they're treating me that way. That's why they're acting towards me that way. That's why they've done that to me. Then I gotta say, wow. So let's look at the verses here, right? Bless them who curse you, right? So that's simply, replying to ugly words with kind words. Sounds simple, right? When someone slams you, your response is kind. Why? Because you have that little gap in there. I always often talk about this gap. There's this gap that God gives us of time to allow us to say, okay, wait, this is not about me. This is not even about him. This is about Satan operating in his life and messing him up such that he would do something like that to me. Therefore, I've got to respond in a way that will help him see God. Right? I got to respond kindly so that he can see God. Do good to those who hate you, right? Same thing. Be benevolent to those men who are evil to you. Pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. right? Pray for those who abuse you. I got to tell you, it's hard to pray for someone that you hate. The more you pray for someone, the less you hate them. The more you pray for someone, the more you love them. The more you pray for someone, the more you actually care what happens to them, and that you really want God to do something amazing in their life.
Hey, Rich, I think a lot of times too, you know, in our modern definition of love, we relate it as only an emotion or a feeling. And I mean, you look into some of the original scriptures in Greek, it was more charity than that word of love that we use today. So I think it's interesting that Christian love's always still people think of as a feeling. You got to feel that way. If I don't feel love, it's not Christian love. And sometimes we just have to act like you're saying and pray, even though we're not feeling it. So,
you know, when Jesus describes love later on, he says that love means obedience, right? That's the connection he makes. Love is obedience. You notice that he doesn't say here, like your enemies, right? He doesn't say, you know, feel that you like them. You know, he says love them. It's an action. I think he was dead on. He's saying love them, do something proactive for them. Jesus loved and gave his son, right? By the way, this is how we move from being sorry for ourselves to being sorry for them when something happens to us. All right, let's jump down to verse 46. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet your brethren only, what will you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? You are supposed to be unexplainable in natural terms. We've talked about this before when the introduction to the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are not natural things. They are divine things. These characteristics of Christ are characteristics of the divine. So when you have these characteristics, they cannot be explained in natural terms. So what this is saying is here is if you are doing these kinds of things, it's not natural. It's not normal. It's supernatural. The Christian is able to do things that other people cannot do. Again, we're explaining what do you do more than your righteousness is to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. You're supposed to be able to do more than that. And by the way, even the scribes and Pharisees of today, you're supposed to do more than. Because you're not like mere men, but like God. You're children of your Father in heaven. And it says, even as your Father in heaven is perfect, you're to be perfect. We'll get to that in a minute. So I'll ask this question to you. Is there something in you that cannot be explained in natural terms? Cannot just be explained away as, oh, he's just a good person. He's just nice. He was born that way. He's got that kind of temperament. Is there anything in you that cannot be explained in natural terms? I don't want you to answer that question. I want you to think on that question while I ask you the next question. And that is, I want you to look at your Bible for a minute in chapter 5, at all that we've gone over. And I want to ask you this question. How is the Christian different? How is the Christian different from the natural man? From mere men.
Well, God is our filter.
Is our what?
Is our filter.
Filter, okay.
Everything we do, say, act, whatever, should be through what he's taught us, how to behave, how to act, how to feel, how to.
Okay, good. I want you to cheat, okay? Look at Matthew chapter 5. What does it say? How does it say we are different from normal people? What are some ways?
All these beatitudes. Love your
Yeah.
enemy.
That's it.
You know, go
Being
the-
humble.
I got a title here that says, go the second mile, do the extra. All the different things it's been telling us to do. The natural man doesn't do all those things naturally.
Keep going. Specifically.
The salt of the earth and the light of the world.
This is our review of chapter 5, in case you hadn't figured this out. What else?
We're blessed.
We are blessed.
That's all
Go
to
ahead.
start.
I didn't hear you.
I said, that's how all the Beatitudes started, saying we're blessed. For those that have that are blessed, you know, if you have those things, you're blessed.
So the Christian is different because they are blessed. I'm just making a statement. That wasn't a question. How else is the Christian different from mere men?
We are God's light in the world.
Yeah. Nobody else can be. What else?
God said, be holy because I am holy.
No one
So,
else, no one else can be.
yeah. And he gives us the ability to do that, that is to grasp.
I'm trying to get you to up your thinking game with regard to recognizing that you are different compared to mere men, compared to just good people. You are different from that. You're not just a good person. You are a divine person because of all these things that we're talking about. What else? What makes you different?
Well, you used the term earlier this morning, we are eternal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone's eternal. Well, everyone's, you're right. We're in a better place.
I would say, Rich, that we're connected to God. We know His word. We know where to go. When we don't have the answers, we're a conduit.
That's good. That's good. I didn't hear it.
Our reward is not here.
Yeah, good.
We can't do it on our own. I mean, even natural man can do good things and be nice to people, but we can't do it on our own. It's Christ living in us that allows us to do these things.
So let me generalize these statements with some phrases, and you've said some of these already, but let me just go down my list. So I think the main thing is that in your thinking, you see things that other people don't see. You understand things that other people don't understand. Your relationship to the law is different. You actually know the real truth. You know the absolute truth. I'm trying to get you to see how amazing you are. You are incredible. You got all this stuff. You understand that morality is not about what I do and not do, but rather who I am like. Let me get that one again. Morality is not this list of do's and don'ts. It's rather about who I am like, i.e. like Christ. That's morality, is being like Christ, not I don't do this, I do that. You understand that about morality. You understand that sin is about the heart and not about actions, right? It's about what's going on in your head and in your heart, not so much the things that you do. You understand that the self is sinful. Again, we began the whole thing with poor in spirit, right? You understand that you're a sinner. When you think about others, it breaks your heart because you recognize that they are victims of sin, and therefore you are salt and light to them. You're amazing. When you think about God, you think of him as your father, not as that wrathful, vengeful person. You think of him as your father, someone who loves. You go beyond just doing good for people, all the way to loving them. When you see the trials of life, you rejoice because you see what's behind it. You see the hidden meanings. You see what's going on. You can look beyond that thing. When you're injured by someone else, you don't just bear it and grumble. You go the second mile joyfully. You're amazing. When you think about death, you don't just have a stiff upper lip about death. You realize it's a homecoming. You're joyful. You're a crazy person. When you think about the world, it's not making the best of it in this world. You realize it's not even my home. I don't even belong here. I'm waiting to go home. I'm waiting to go where God is there and Christ is there, and I will be loved completely. And as somebody already said, you know that the future because you know your home's in heaven. And even when
Hope. You're making me think of the word hope.
hope, absolutely.
That's what we know.
This whole world has no hope. I mean, and if you spend too much time looking at it and listening to the news, your hope gets taken away, right? But we have hope because we again know what's going on behind the scenes, and we know how it all ends. We know where it's going.
Mhm.
The only other one I'll add, just as when we think about this Sermon on the Mount, it's not, I'm going to try my best to do that. It's rather, it breaks my heart that I'm not like that. Right? It's not, hey, here's my rules. Now my new rules, I'm going to start doing these things. No, it's really, it breaks my heart. I'm not like that. I'm not more like Christ. And it drives me right to hunger and thirst for righteousness. So I just want you to recognize that you are weirdly different from the world. Bizarrely strange. And again, to me, verse 45, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, right? So some of you know, many of you know that my dad left when I was an infant. and even though I got to know him later on in life, I didn't have a dad growing up. Right, so I clung to that passage in the Old Testament that said God is father to the fatherless. So when it talks here about this is how you know that you look like your dad, that's really important to me, right? This is how I show that I'm like my dad, is by being like this, by having these characteristics, by responding in this way when things happen. Look again now, let's look again at verse 48 to wrap this up. It says, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And I can tell you, I read a bunch of, again, commentaries on this one, and they're so stupid. I want to give you an amazing statement about this verse. Notice what it says, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Notice what it does not say. It does not say, therefore you shall be perfect, just as God is perfect. Right? It doesn't say that. It doesn't say God. It says your Father. Your Father. The one who gave you the Holy Spirit. The one who is connected to you familially. You are part of his family. And what he's saying is, you're going to look like your dad. You're going to look like him. You're going to be perfect just like he's perfect. You have the divine nature in you. You have God in you. And that's what he's trying to say here. You shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect, because you have the divine nature in you. You shall be as you grow closer to him in this world, and you certainly shall be in eternity. So then I got to ask you again this question. Do you resemble your Father? I didn't say you're exactly like him, but do you resemble him? Would anybody say, oh yeah, you look just like your dad? I can see your dad in you. You've got his eyes. You know, one thing I've recognized is that as we get older, we look more and more like our parents, whether we like it or not. And I think the same is true here, right? As we mature more and more in the faith, we look more and more like God. We look more and more like Christ as we mature in the faith. And I think that's exactly what he's trying to say here. We're to be like Christ. We're to be like God. We're to be like our Father. All right, that is the end of chapter 5. And I promise we won't spend as much time on any other chapter. Bill and I were looking back. We began this in the middle of April, chapter 5. We've been here a while.
Yes.
Any other thoughts on this? Love your enemies? Questions? Now, I sometimes I feel like I'm beating you up too much.
No.
So feel free to give me some feedback on that. Because you know I'm beating me up more than I'm beating you up whenever I go through these. God slams me down to the floor when I'm reading through these, and then I feel like I need to. But sometimes I feel like I'm a little bit too harsh. So feel free to let me know if I'm that. I'm trying to be honest with what it's saying, and yeah. All right. Anything else?
I
Yes.
need a lesson today. The more I deal with the world day by day by day, I get a little whittled away on it every day and feel like I lose my hope. I come in here and get this, and this is what I needed today.
And I would say, Rich, that everybody makes mistakes. We're not perfect. We're going to screw up. And that God, being a heavenly Father, knows that. I mean, look at the life of Peter. He denied the Lord, right? And God used him in a powerful way. So that reminds me that we do have a benevolent God. He does love us unconditionally, and that no matter how much we screw up, he's going to give us another chance.
You know, one thing I forgot as we went through, we think about God loving his enemies. Remember that we were enemies, right? We were enemies before we were saved, and God loved us. You know, it's amazing, God. God's amazing. Anyway, okay. Anything else? I wasn't trying to get feedback there in real time. I'm just letting you know I struggle with knowing how harsh to be. All right. Prayer requests. So let's see. Joe's not here. She's getting ready. We're leaving as soon as we're done here to go. Oh.
Turn off recording.
Recording it turned.
What?
Got it. Thank you.